Welcome to TBP Insights. Today we're going to continue the series by looking at how to play the big blind versus small way, three-way in a limp pot. So when it comes to obviously playing in the big blind versus the small blind, the button's open folded. Small blind has made their decision, and in this instance they've decided to just limp. We will have a range and we will have strategies based on how we want to play certain combinations versus a limp. For today's video, though, we are just going to focus on just flat calling and taking it post flop, and we'll discuss, isolation strategies in future videos. So with that in mind, small blinds limped pre, we've checked back, and we're now post flop. So small blinds out of position here. So they've got the first decision to make. So whether they check, whether they bet. If our opponent bets just a normal C bet, then we would obviously continue our range and play very much ABC versus recreational players. So continue with value. Maybe look at raising some good backdoor combinations or some open-ended straight draws, some gut shots, etc. versus specific player profiles. But in general, we want to just play a solid strategy here. We can call obviously combinations which have potential to increase EV on the turns, etc. But we don't need to do anything funky. If we're newer to the format, we don't need to complicate things. We don't need to fight for every single pot versus recreationals, because there is no need to potentially risk, damaging our future EV, etc. So play your ABC strategy here, and then obviously the hand will play it out itself based on how our opponent reacts. Generally, when it comes to a recreational who c-bets, you might find that they c-bet again on the turn with smaller sizing, which will allow us to continue slightly wider. But if they c-bet on the flop and then increase sizing on the turn, we then need to look at obviously maintaining a very, very disciplined approach here, calling combinations on the turn which we think can call it a further bet on the river, because recreationals, when they are invested in a pot, do like to go bet, especially if they started to increase sizing on the turn. So we should make sure that we're not calling turn combinations here incorrectly to then fold on the river, because we're just costing ourselves value. A concept we wanted to introduce today is when we face a check versus a recreational post flop in the big blind. So here the opponent had the opportunity to to bet on the small blind, and they've opted to check. If we just flip back to different positions when playing versus a recreational, we understand that necessarily they don't understand initiative too much. So in previous videos we've discussed a donking range from recreationals, whereby they bet out of position with a hand because they like what they have. Right now, if we move this logic over to this scenario, whereby now it would be correct for a recreational to bet but they haven't, we can often assume that if they decide not to bet, then they've got a weaker range. And the reason for this is because previously, and various other positions, they like to bet, right? So they like to bet their top pairs, their middle pairs, their draws, their random combinations. So a float bet versus a recreational is a very, very strong tool that we can use. And a float bet is basically betting in position versus an opponent who had initiative but has opted to check. And what we do is we use this as an extreme exploit against all types of recreationals and unknown, as if we had the initiative ourselves. And the reason for this is because we want to maximize the fold equity that we can generate from them checking on the flop to us float betting or betting one big blind and taking the pot down there and then. There is some more advanced concepts or certain instances whereby we might decide to skip the bet on the flop, just purely because we've got a value combination or we've got a hand, and we want to give the recreational additional streaks to potentially hit something themselves as a way to maximize value from this combination. But in general, it could be a nice strategy to implement into your current games if you're not doing this yourself. So if you face a check versus a recreational post flop in the small blind, bet one big blind yourself and see whether or not a float strategy is effective versus your player pool. If it is, then obviously this is a really, really nice quick fix that you can implement into your game moving forward to look at increasing your win rates three-way. One of the key things that is very, very important when playing versus recreationals overall is to play solid. And when it comes to a situation whereby the recreational is as c-bet on the flop, and we've had a combination which allowed us to call correctly on the flop, when it comes to the turn, recreationals can play a few different ways. So you have recreationals who like the one big blind, one big blind, one big blind line. You have the recreationals who like to size up on the turn and therefore continue their value and size up on the river. When we're playing versus a recreational who's betting another one big blind on the turn, obviously pot odds wise and mathematically, this will allow us to call a wider range because of the odds. However, we should then make to ensure that we play correctly on the river. If they go one big blind, one big blind, one big blind, for example, then we can probably look to calling them down quite lightly. However, we should 100% not be random here. When it comes to a recreational increasing their sizing on the turn, then we need to understand that this recreational is likely to continue the aggression on the river and further increase their sizing. So our calling range on the turn should be very, very disciplined, because we want to look to find combinations whereby if we call on the turn, then we can potentially look to call on the river with value, right? And win the pot. What we don't want to do is we don't want to overcall turns to then overfold rivers, because this is a very expensive mistake. And it's a mistake quite a lot of players new to the game make. Every decision that we make on a street, we should always consider future decisions and how they're linked to future streets. So top tips of today is float bet versus recreationals if you haven't been doing so already. And when it comes to a recreationals, continue in range on the turn when they've seen it on the flop. Be very, very disciplined and ensure that we're not overcalling to then overfold rivers. Thank you very much for joining us today, and more videos to be released soon. Good luck at the tables.